He was primarily offered the prize because of the Camp David peace agreements in 1978, which established a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, and that was regarded as a great diplomatic triumph and so on. That's a gross misrepresentation of the facts. In fact, the peace treaty was based on an offer that Egypt made in 1971. In 1971, President Sadat of Egypt offered a full peace treaty to Israel, mentioning nothing about the Palestinians, nothing about the occupied territories, full peace in return for Israeli evacuation of Egyptian territory, Sinai. Israel recognized it as a genuine peace offer, considered it, turned it down because they wanted to expand into the Sinai. The U.S. had to make a choice at that point. Egypt was in fact following the U.S. position, official position. The U.S. had to decide whether to persist in that or to shift it and support Israeli expansion. Henry Kissinger called for what he called stalemate. No negotiations, just reliance on force. The U.S. backed Israel's rejection of the offer. That led almost directly to the 1973 war, which was very dangerous for Israel, very destructive, almost led to a nuclear war. Years of oppression, violence, and terror. Finally, in 1977 and 78, the U.S. and Israel basically accepted Sadat's original offer. I don't regard that as a diplomatic triumph. I think it was a diplomatic catastrophe.
Matthew Conover. Hi, I'm a bit of a fan of Mr. Chomsky's work since picking Necessary Illusions 5 or 6 years ago. Since then, I've read countless essays and interviews and finding American power and the new Mandarins rather relevant to current events. However, Mr. Chomsky makes it clear he doesn't like his personal life discussed because he disdains the cult of personality. I completely understand this, but it doesn't stop me from being curious about his life. So I was excited to read the New Yorker profile a couple of months ago. I'm just wondering if Mr. Chomsky also read it and what his thoughts are about it are.
I wouldn't comment on it, frankly, but...
Did you cooperate?
Except to advise you not to take anything in it seriously unless you can verify it independently. It's an attack on a hated political enemy in an attempt to discredit them. You can decide for yourself whether it's right or wrong, but just check anything verifiable in it.
Attack on you, in other words.
I understand what they're up to.
Did you talk to them?
I talk to anybody. You know, any journalist comes into my office, I talk to them.
Farquhar was the woman who wrote the piece, I believe.
But that's for you to judge. Just check through anything in it that you can verify, okay, and see what you discover.
Hello, Dr. Chomsky. This is from Catherine B. King. Will you give us your severest criticism of the left as a general movement, but also as manifest in today's ethical and political situation? I think we may learn more about how to make things work from such a critique than from the current polemic with the right.
So should there be a critique of the left?
Will you give us your severest criticism of the left?
Well, you know, the left is so amorphous, I don't know what to say. I mean, there are parts of the left that I disagree with radically. There are parts of what's called the left that I support. I just don't know how to comment. I mean, there are many of the positions taken by people who are considered on the left, I think, are completely wrong, others completely right. You have to go case by case.
Jerry Stinson of Greenwich, Connecticut. 2 or 3 weeks ago, I emailed Professor Chomsky on the importance of voting George W. Bush out of office in November 2004. His courteous reply expressed agreement that this particular president should not be given an additional 4 years in office. Assuming then that Professor Chomsky believes President Bush is worth mobilizing voters against, I'd like to hear his reasons for believing so. To put it very simply, what's so bad about President Bush?
Well, President Bush stands for an international and a domestic policy, both of which I think are extremely dangerous. The domestic policy is what was discussed earlier, to drive the country into a fiscal train wreck through tax cuts benefiting the wealthy, which will lead to the elimination of social programs like those that Ari Fleischer mentioned, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, probably schools, others, and return the population to the country to a period before the progressive legislation of the past century, which has very much improved things. I don't think it's perfect, but it's been an improvement. I think that's a disaster. Internationally, the program is exactly what was stated in the National Security Strategy, a call for U.S. global domination through force, with acceptance of the right to attack anyone who might potentially challenge U.S. domination. That's outlandish. I mean, that's a call for us to be submitted to Nuremberg trials.
Greenwich, Connecticut, you're on the air.
Very ironic. That was my letter you read. If I could just ask the rest of the other question, and that is...
This is Jerry Stenson. Is this you, Jerry Stenson?
Yes.
Okay. I can get the rest of it is they're a candidate, declared or undeclared, Democrat or not, who you believe offer a significant alternative to Bush and can win. Is that what you want?
That's it.
Thanks. Thank you.
Well, there are two questions. They're a significant alternative and can win. Like I think Dennis Kucinich offers a very significant alternative, but whether he can ever amass... remember, an election in the United States, unfortunately, is a media campaign, a media show, in fact, based on huge funding, primarily corporate funding. It's a public relations show, and we ought to change that, but that's the way it is. On other candidates, it's a complicated story. I won't comment.
New York City.
Dr. Chomsky, it's a privilege to speak with you. I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on the U.S.'s most recent immigration policy, where it is drastically reducing the numbers of highly skilled and professional, educated workers from China, India, Pakistan, and other developing countries, ostensibly to reduce unemployment among qualified Americans. And yet, on the other hand, they're freely granting immigration and citizenship to workers from Mexico, Cuba, who are, for the most part, minimum wage earners. I was wondering if you thought there were any political as opposed to economic reasons for this.
Well, groups, Cuba is a separate case. I mean, the U.S. has been trying to stimulate immigration from Cuba, but that's because it's been trying since 1959 to bring down the Cuban government. Mexico, again, is a special case. Low-wage Mexican labor maintains part of the lifestyle of Americans by producing extremely cheap exploited labor, which is working under inhuman conditions in the agricultural system. That's a disgrace in itself. As to keeping out more skilled workers, well, that's groups that have power are going to try to protect themselves. And skilled professionals do have wield considerable power. They don't want to be, they don't want competition. What immigration policy should be like is another question altogether. I mean, if we believed in free trade, if anybody believed in free trade, they would accept Adam Smith's principle that free trade is based on free distribution of labor, free movement of labor, and not just free movement of capital. Is that a correct policy? Well, probably not, because there are a lot of other issues that conflict with it about, maintaining national cultures and all sorts of other things. So I think it's not easy to state generally what an immigration policy should be like, but the reasons for the choices that you're pointing to, I think, are reasonably clear.
I know you said we should make up our own mind on the New Yorker article, but there's a couple of paragraphs I want to read and ask you about it. It has to do with your wife, who is with you today, Carol.
Ask her. She's in the other room.
How many years have you been married?
Since 1949.
Carol shares her husband's views and has been politically involved herself, but she dislikes the activist existence even more than he does. My life has certainly not turned out the way I expected, she said. To me, the interesting question is, if I were in the position of making the choice to marry now, would I choose him? She went on. That's a funny question. Who knows? I mean, it's very different from what I expected, just in terms of the fame and notoriety and whatever you call it, the intrusion into public life, the ridiculous clutching at him, the noblesse oblige aspect. Sometimes he says, I just have to take that call. We've actually got it now so that the phone almost never rings, except when it rings at 3 a.m. from some party where kids are having an ecstasy rave or who knows what.
Well,
is that in context?
Very much out of context and selected in order to present a certain impression. I mean, some of the words may be accurate, but that's the reporter's goal, is to present a certain picture. You can ask my wife how she thinks about that.
It's too bad we have more time. We get her out of here. El Cajon, California, you're on the air.
Good afternoon. Dr. Chomsky, I'm wondering if you might comment on the failure to find the weapons of mass destruction that were supposedly held by Iraq, and the implications that would have for the United States and in the world if no such weapons are found. Thank you.
Well, there's out in the rest of the world, it's a big issue. In England, it's leading to major attacks on the government. The former Foreign Secretary Robin Cook just had a long, sharp critique of the government for simply lying to the public. The position of the British government was very simple and straightforward.
You know that Mr. Blair said today that he's going to lay out the information which will show that they have found weapons of mass destruction.
Okay, I haven't seen that, yeah. But up till now, they have not presented any meaningful evidence. I mean, frankly, I'm surprised. I mean, I would be very surprised if you couldn't find some evidence that Iraq was producing biological and chemical weapons. My suspicion is if you, actually, 40 miles from Washington, last week, someone found, they found anthrax and other bacteria that had been left over from some program, presumably terminated, so they claim. And you're certainly going to find that somewhere or other. But the failure to find the weapons of mass destruction that were claimed and the undermining of specific claims has been pretty remarkable. You'll recall that Colin Powell's position and the official government position here was, his words, the single issue is, will Iraq disarm? If that was the single issue and you can't find weapons of mass destruction, that means plenty of fabrication. And in fact, the intelligence community itself is up in arms about this.
We got one call left, and we're finished. Newton, Georgia, go ahead, please.
Noam, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the late John Rawls' theory of justice.
Thanks. We've just got a minute.
Yeah, well, he's an extraordinarily important philosopher and a wonderful person. I knew him. It's a tremendously important book. It revitalized political philosophy in the 20th century.
Your immediate future? You're here in Washington to do something later today?
I got a talk, as usual, this afternoon. Back to Boston, more talks, more.
Next book?
Writing a book, middle of a book, almost finishing a book right now.
When will it be out?
As soon as I find enough scattered moments here and there to put in the final pieces of it.
You're
in the fall, I hope.
You're 74 years old?
Yep, coming up to 75.
Plan to retire anytime soon from all of this?
Formally, I retired a couple of years ago, but that's formal, just bookkeeping changes. No, I don't see any major changes in the future.
If you've just joined us, we've had 3 hours with Dr. Noam Chomsky. He's based at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a native of Philadelphia, a graduate of University of Pennsylvania, 1949, got his MA there in 51 and his PhD in 55, and has published 98 books in his life. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks to our audience. Have a good day.
You've been watching In Depth with Noam Chomsky. If you missed any portion of the 3-hour interview, you can see this program again at 6 p.m. Eastern and tonight at midnight Eastern. Next month on In Depth, Carlo D'Este. For 3 hours, the Patton and Eisenhower biographer will discuss his complete body of work, including Bitter Victory, Decision in Normandy, Fatal Decision, A Genius for War, and his latest, Eisenhower, A Soldier's Life, just released in paperback. Sunday, July 6th, live at noon Eastern. In Depth with Carlo D'Este.
Hello and welcome to day 2 of Book TV's live coverage of Book Expo, the nation's largest book trade show, which is going on this weekend at the Los Angeles Convention Center. We're here inside South Hall, where today 2,000 exhibitors, 1,200 publishers,